Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Ready to explore how bias can, kinda, sneak into performance management? We've got some really insightful articles and research, and I think this is one that's going to hit home for a lot of you listening out there. Oh, hey, if you enjoy what you hear today, think about hitting that subscribe button for the My Mosaic channel. We're just getting started, and your support means a lot. Helps us keep making this stuff.
Absolutely. This is a topic everyone's professional life is touched by. And honestly, what really stood out to me was that tale of bias busting Bob from the stuff we're looking at. It's just a story, but it captures how universal this bias thing is in performance reviews.
Oh, you mean the one with Bob and all those bias reviews? Super clever writing, made me laugh. But like you said, there's a serious point under the humor. Bias is everywhere, even when we're convinced we're being totally objective.
Exactly. It's not about, pointing fingers or saying you're biased. It's about realizing we all have these tendencies, these unconscious things that mess with our judgment, especially when we're evaluating other people.
Okay, so Bob's story. Let's get into it. Bob's working hard, hits all his targets the whole year. Then, bam, right before performance reviews, makes a tiny mistake.
Uh-oh.
And suddenly,
Yeah.
all his accomplishments, gone, poof. Manager only sees that one error.
Classic recency bias. It's like judging a movie only on the last 5 minutes. I bet you've experienced this. Ace a project all year, one slip up right before review time, and that's all anyone remembers. Super frustrating. That's recency bias playing out, affecting how we see and evaluate others.
It makes you wonder how many talented people get judged unfairly because of this. Seems so wrong when you think of Bob's effort all year. But let's step back from Bob for a sec. Talk bigger picture performance management. It's supposed to be good, right? Help employees grow, all that.
Ideally, yeah. It's a powerful tool. Done right, it can boost engagement, well-being, even customer satisfaction, drive that organizational growth.
But here's the thing all our sources point out. The intention is good, but performance management easily becomes like a breeding ground for unfairness. A system designed for good, hijacked by bias.
Exactly the problem. Bias creeps in, undermines the good stuff, and suddenly it doesn't feel fair at all. Imagine being judged through that biased lens all the time. How motivated would you be to do your best?
Not very. It'd be like running a race where the finish line keeps moving.
Yeah.
So let's get down to brass tacks. How does this bias actually show up in reviews? I think a lot of people might not even realize it's happening to them.
One of the most common ways is subjective evaluation. So picture two managers, same employee. One sees assertive leadership, the other sees bossiness. See how bias sneaks in. No clear criteria, and evaluations just become personal opinions.
That's a great example. Without those clear guidelines, it's like we're all speaking different languages when we talk about performance. What's proactive to one person might be pushy to someone else. No wonder there's so many misunderstandings and unfair judgments.
Absolutely. And this subjectivity opens the door to a whole bunch of other biases. Remember Bob. His manager, after focusing on that one mistake, might start seeing Bob's past actions negatively too.
Ah, so that's confirmation bias, right? We look for info that confirms what we already believe, even if it's not the whole picture. Once that negative impression is formed, it's sticky, even if Bob has a history of success.
Exactly. And confirmation bias can be sneaky. We might not even realize we're doing it. But it's super important to be aware of, especially in performance management.
So it's a vicious cycle. Bob messes up once, the manager fixates on it, and then everything, every interaction, every past project is seen through the lens of that one error. Talk about unfair.
Totally unfair. And it doesn't just affect fairness. This kind of bias hurts the whole organization too.
You mean beyond just Bob's experience?
Yeah. When bias gets into performance management, it causes a bunch of problems. Low morale, missed chances to grow, the whole 9 yards.
Let's unpack that. What are the real consequences of letting bias fester in a performance management system? I think it's key to understand why this isn't just an individual's problem, but an organizational one.
For one, think about employee morale. If people feel judged unfairly, resentment, less motivation, and ultimately worse performance.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't think you'll get a fair shot, why even try? Creates this atmosphere of distrust that can spread through the whole workplace.
Absolutely. And it's bigger than just one person's morale. Bias can create distrust across the entire organization. Think about it. Talented people feel held back by unfair evaluations. They might start job hunting.
Huge loss for the company. And not just about losing good people. The 3 Steps to Reduce Bias in Performance Management article. It highlighted how bias can lead to uneven chances for promotions and development.
Exactly, and that's a big problem. If certain groups are always overlooked for promotions or training, it creates inequality. It's not just unfair, it's bad for the company's success.
It's like shooting yourself in the foot. If you're only promoting people who fit a certain mold, you're missing out on so much talent and different perspectives.
Yeah.
And that stifles innovation and limits what the entire workforce can achieve.
And here's another crucial point. The Common Management Biases source pointed out that bias can actually prevent managers from seeing and correcting problem behavior. It's kind of a paradox. Bias, which is supposed to help spot areas for improvement, ends up making managers blind to real issues.
Wait, hold on. That's fascinating. How does that work? I'd think a manager focusing on weaknesses would be more likely to see those problems.
It's not so straightforward. If a manager is blinded by bias, they might miss an employee's true strengths and weaknesses. They might excuse bad behavior in one person, but be really harsh on someone else for the same thing. Creates inconsistency and undermines accountability.
So it's not just about being fair to employees. It's about giving managers the tools to be good leaders who can give useful feedback.
Exactly. It's about a culture of accountability and improvement. And that's impossible if bias is distorting how we see things and make judgments. Bias isn't just a feel-good issue. It has real consequences for everyone involved.
So we've agreed. Bias is bad news. It has real consequences, and we need to tackle it head on. But how do we actually do something about it? How do we go from just knowing about it to taking action?
That's the million-dollar question. The good news is bias, even though it's everywhere, it's not unbeatable. There are things organizations can do, practical steps to lessen these risks, create performance management systems that are fairer and more effective.
That Pern-Candola article, they had those 3 recommendations, remember? Objective processes, measurable goals, and bias-busting workshops. Let's unpack those. Starting with objective processes, what does that even mean in the real world?
It means having clear, specific criteria for evaluation, and you apply those same criteria across the board. It's about getting rid of those vague, subjective assessments, the ones that bias loves to latch onto.
So instead of saying something like, this employee needs to be more of a team player, you'd have like specific measures, examples of what good teamwork looks like in that role, almost like a scoring system for performance, right?
Right on. It takes the guesswork out. No more relying on gut feelings, which is where bias can creep in. And that leads us perfectly to the second recommendation, measurable goals.
Yeah, because measurable goals, they make things clear for everyone, both the employees and the managers. When everyone knows what's expected, how you'll measure success, there's less room for, being unclear. And that's where bias can sneak in. It's about leveling the playing field.
You got it. Transparency and fairness. You know what you need to do to succeed, and your manager can't just decide you didn't measure up for no good reason. But wait a minute. Wouldn't focusing too much on those objective metrics kill creativity? What about those skills that are hard to measure, those contributions that aren't just numbers?
That's a great point. It's like, how do we balance being objective with allowing room for those less quantifiable things? Maybe it's about how we define the metrics, not just numbers, but including some qualitative assessments to capture those more subtle aspects of performance.
I think you're onto something there. Maybe it's a combo of quantitative and qualitative measures. But the key is, those criteria still need to be clear and consistent for everyone, right? But we can still have a more well-rounded view of what an employee contributes.
Which brings us to the third recommendation. Those bias-busting workshops. This is where we get real about addressing those unconscious biases.
You bet. These workshops, they're essential. Raising awareness, giving managers the tools to spot and deal with their own biases. It's like shining a light on those unconscious things we all have, the assumptions that affect how we see things without us even realizing it.
But isn't it uncomfortable to face those biases? I can imagine some people would resist the idea that they even have biases.
Oh, there might be some awkwardness at first, but think of it this way. We're all shaped by our experiences, how we were raised, our culture. Those experiences affect how we see the world. It's natural for some unconscious biases to slip in. The trick is to make a safe space where people can explore those biases without feeling judged or attacked.
So it's less about blaming and more about opening up a conversation, letting people reflect. I like that. Seems more welcoming, less like an accusation.
You got it. And this isn't a one-time thing. Bias training, it needs to be part of the company culture. Regular refreshers, chances to talk about it. It's an ongoing process of awareness, education, holding ourselves accountable.
Because no matter how hard we try to overcome our biases, they're always going to be there, lurking, waiting for a chance to slip in. It's like we got to be on guard constantly, Questioning what we assume, checking our blind spots.
Couldn't have said it better. Constant training, self-reflection, open conversations, those are essential to keep those biases in check. Now, the Pern-Condola strategies are great, a solid base, but I think the other sources we looked at have some valuable insights too.
Yeah, for sure. Always more to learn. Different points of view help us understand better. It's like putting together a puzzle. Each source gives us a piece, put them all together, and we get the whole picture.
Exactly, like the Risley FAQs. They emphasized active listening as a way to reduce bias. Really hearing your employees, not just waiting for your turn to talk.
That's so important. Creating a space where people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing ideas, being themselves, without worrying about being judged. Active listening, it takes effort. Setting aside your own ideas and really tuning in to what the other person is saying, both the words and the nonverbal cues.
You nailed it. And that connects to another point Risley made. Diversity and inclusion efforts matter. When you have people from different backgrounds, different experiences, different ways of thinking, it challenges those ingrained biases, forces everyone to expand their idea of what good even means.
It's like that saying, if you're always the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Diversity brings in new ideas, makes you question what you think you know, and that leads to better decisions, including in performance management. But wait, wouldn't a truly diverse workplace naturally have more subjective evaluations? Since everyone's bringing their own perspectives and values to the table.
That's a good question. But it all goes back to those objective processes we talked about, having those clear, consistent standards for evaluating performance. That helps make sure everyone's being judged fairly, never their background or who they are. Diversity without structure. Yeah, that can lead to more personal opinions, which is why we need both.
So it's about finding that balance, where diversity helps us understand better, broadens our horizons. And those objective processes, they're the framework for evaluations that are fair and equal. It's like weaving together these different threads to create a tapestry of a workplace that's truly inclusive and high-performing.
Beautiful analogy. And it highlights how complex this issue is. There's no quick fix, no magic solution. It takes a multifaceted approach, dealing with both individual biases and the systemic stuff.
And it's a journey, right? We'll never get to a point where bias is completely gone. But by continuously learning, adapting, questioning our own assumptions, we can make the workplace more just and equitable for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. It's about fostering a culture of always learning and improving, where everyone's dedicated to creating an environment that's more inclusive and fair.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today, from that funny story about bias-busting Bob to the serious consequences of bias going unchecked. But we're going to have to pause here for now. But don't worry, we'll be back in part 3 to wrap up our deep dive into bias in performance management. We'll sum up the key takeaways and leave you with some final food for thought. All right, welcome back to the deep dive for the final part of our exploration into bias, specifically in performance management.
Phew, we really dug deep, huh?
We did, from laughing at bias-busting Bob to getting serious about what happens when bias runs wild at work.
We saw how all these different types of bias can slip into reviews, often without us even noticing.
And we talked about why it's not enough to just identify bias. We got to understand the impact it has on individuals, teams, the whole company, everyone, really.
But the best part, we talked about what can be done about it.
We looked at practical ways to reduce bias, like having clear, objective processes, setting goals you can actually measure, and giving managers training to deal with their own biases.
We also talked about how important active listening is. Building a workplace where everyone feels included and safe to be themselves, and constantly checking those assumptions we all make.
So now think about you, listening right now. What are the big takeaways you can use in your own work life?
Yeah. Have you ever been in Bob's shoes? Maybe recency bias or a subjective evaluation affected your review.
It's worth taking a moment to think about those times. How would things have been different if it was more fair, more objective?
And even if you haven't personally experienced bias, you've probably seen it happen, maybe without even realizing what it was at the time.
The more we shine a light on these biases, talk about them, challenge them, the closer we get to a workplace where everyone feels valued and can succeed.
Absolutely. So as you move forward in your career, keep what we talked about today in mind. Advocate for fairness, question assumptions, and work towards a workplace where everyone has a chance to shine.
And hey, if you like this deep dive into the messy world of bias and performance reviews, consider subscribing to the Mind Mosaic channel. We've got tons more thought-provoking stuff coming your way, and your support really helps us keep growing.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better, more equitable world for all of us.